I never thought of myself as someone who would stumble upon a betrayal so profound, so life-altering, that it would dismantle the very foundation of my life. Sarah and I met at a party more than 2 decades ago. I remember how effortlessly she lit up the room with her laugh and the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. She had this aura about her, a magnetism that drew everyone in, including me. For 3 years, we dated in that blissful haze of new love, and when I finally worked up the courage to propose, she said yes without hesitation. That moment felt like winning the lottery. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We weathered life together, built a home, raised 2 incredible children, and celebrated every milestone with an earnestness that only 2 people truly in love could share. Or so I thought. 20 years into our marriage, the moment came that shattered it all. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation you'd see in a movie. No shouting, no screaming, no tears. Just a quiet moment of confusion, discovery, and disbelief. It began when I was looking for my reading glasses. Sarah had a habit of throwing things into her oversized handbag, and I was certain she'd accidentally picked them up. As I rummaged through the endless pit of keys, receipts, and lipsticks, my fingers brushed against the corner of a photo. It was tucked between a folded receipt and a tube of mascara, the edge worn like it had been handled too many times. Curious, I pulled it out. The photo was old, at least 5 years by the looks of it. In it, Sarah was sitting on a porch swing I didn't recognize, laughing, her hand resting intimately on the shoulder of a man I immediately recognized. Mark, her childhood friend. My stomach dropped as I stared at the image. Mark was a name that floated into our conversations over the years, but always as a footnote. A funny story from her youth. A familiar face at family gatherings. Never someone I felt threatened by. But this picture, this wasn't casual. This wasn't platonic. I confronted Sarah that evening, the photo burning a hole in my pocket. I could barely keep my voice steady as I asked her about it. She froze, her hand mid-reach for the wine glass she'd just poured. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. But she quickly masked it with confusion. "Oh, that's Mark," she said lightly, taking a sip of her wine. "We took that picture when I visited my parents. You remember that trip?" I remembered the trip vividly. It was 5 years ago, and she had insisted on going alone, citing the need for some space and time to reconnect with her roots. At the time, it hadn't raised any alarms. After all, we trusted each other, didn't we? "Why was this in your bag?" I pressed. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. Her response was nonchalant, but her eyes betrayed her. "I don't know. It must have gotten mixed up in there somehow." "What's the big deal?" The big deal was that I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, the same gut that had never failed me before. Something was wrong. That night, while she slept soundly beside me, I couldn't close my eyes. My thoughts raced, my chest tightened, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. Unable to let it go, I made the decision to confront Mark. He lived 2 towns over, and I hadn't spoken to him in years. I told myself it was for closure, to get the truth straight from the source. But deep down, I already knew the answer. Mark's house was modest, tucked into a quiet neighborhood where the trees lined the streets like sentinels. I hadn't been there in years, not since that awkward barbecue Sarah dragged me to shortly after we were married. Even then, something about Mark struck me as odd, too charming, too familiar with her. But Sarah laughed it off, called me silly for overthinking it. "He's just a friend," she'd said, brushing it away like lint on her sleeve. I let it go then, but I couldn't let it go now. As I pulled into his driveway, I rehearsed the conversation in my head. What would I say? How would I begin? There was no easy way to broach it, no script for a situation like this. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and for a fleeting moment, I considered leaving. But the photo in my pocket felt like a weight, dragging me back into my conviction. I needed answers. Mark opened the door, his face lighting up in genuine surprise. "Hey man, long time no see. What brings you here?" His warmth felt like an insult, a mockery of the turmoil swirling inside me. I forced a smile, stepping inside at his invitation. The house smelled of old wood and faintly of coffee, a smell I might have found comforting under different circumstances. We exchanged pleasantries over mugs of black coffee, the kind that burned your tongue and stayed bitter no matter how much sugar you stirred in. Mark was as disarming as ever, his easy demeanor masking any cracks I might have been searching for. He asked about the kids, the job, even Sarah. "She's good," I replied, the words catching in my throat. "Actually, she mentioned you recently. Made me think I should stop by, catch up." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he recovered quickly, smiling. Sarah always was good at keeping people connected. It was a harmless statement on the surface, but it dug at me. How connected had they been? I left an hour later with no new information but a deepened sense of unease. Mark had given nothing away, his demeanor as polished as ever. Yet something about the way he smiled when I mentioned Sarah left a bad taste in my mouth. It was too knowing, too practiced. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sarah was beside me, her breaths deep and even in sleep. My mind raced, replaying the conversation, dissecting Mark's every word and gesture. The photo sat on my nightstand, its edges now soft from where I had thumbed it repeatedly. I told myself to let it go. It had been years, and Sarah had always been faithful, hadn't she? But doubt is insidious. It starts as a whisper, then grows louder until it drowns out everything else. The following weeks were a blur of routine and suspicion. I began watching Sarah more closely, how her phone always seemed to be face down on the counter, how her laughter seemed a little too forced when I made a joke. I even started noticing little things I'd overlooked for years, like the fact that she always went out of her way to visit her parents alone. I rationalized it as her needing the solitude, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't confront her outright. Not yet. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. Until then, I would play the part of the trusting husband while the threads of my certainty unraveled in the background. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of suspicion became a constant presence in my life. It was there when I kissed Sarah goodbye each morning, lurking behind the forced smile I gave her as she left for work. It lingered in the quiet moments when the kids were at school, and I was alone in the house, replaying every memory that might have held a hidden clue. I began searching for evidence, though the very act made me feel like a man I no longer recognized. I scrolled through Sarah's social media, looking for anything that might betray a connection to Mark. I combed through old emails and texts when she left her phone unattended, my heart pounding every time I heard footsteps down the hall. But there was nothing, no damning messages, no late-night calls. Just the absence of something tangible to soothe my restless mind. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the attic, where we stored the relics of our lives. Dusty boxes of forgotten photographs, school projects from the kids' younger years, and the odd piece of furniture that had outlived its use. I told myself I was looking for something innocuous. A file, a keepsake. But the truth was I hoped to stumble upon anything that might confirm or deny my fears. After hours of sifting through the clutter, I found a shoebox filled with old letters and mementos from Sarah's past. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from Mark, written when they were teenagers, filled with the easy affection of youthful infatuation. At first, I brushed them off as harmless. Who didn't have an old flame from their younger years? But the further I read, the more unsettled I became. The letters revealed a closeness that felt too intimate, too enduring. They spoke of promises to always stay in each other's lives, to remain a constant even as time and circumstance changed everything else. One letter in particular stood out, dated just a year before our wedding. It ended with a line that sent a chill down my spine. "No matter where life takes us, you'll always be the one I think about when I'm alone." I returned the letters to the box and left the attic, my mind racing. It wasn't proof of anything, certainly not of infidelity, but it deepened the cracks in my trust. Mark had always been more than just a childhood friend. And now, with that knowledge coloring every interaction, I couldn't ignore the possibility that he might have been something more recently too. That evening, as Sarah and I sat in the living room watching TV, I stole glances at her, searching for any sign of guilt or unease. She seemed so normal, so at ease. She laughed at the show, commented on the characters, even teased me about falling asleep midway through. How could someone who seemed so genuine be hiding something so devastating? The next day, I found myself outside Mark's house again. I had no plan, no excuse for being there. It was as if some unseen force had driven me back to the place where my doubts had begun to take shape. Mark opened the door, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, stepping aside to let me in. This time, there were no pleasantries. I didn't bother with small talk or the facade of catching up. Instead, I sat across from him in the same chair as before and stared him down, the photo burning a hole in my pocket once more. "Mark," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "I need you to be honest with me. Has anything ever happened between you and Sarah? Anything I should know about?" He blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before his expression shifted to one of measured calm. "What are you asking me, exactly?" "You know what I'm asking," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "I'm asking if there's something between you and my wife that I don't know about." For a moment he said nothing, his gaze locked on mine. Then he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I think you should talk to Sarah." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an explanation. It was a subtle deflection, and it only made my suspicions worse. Without another word, I left his house, the sound of the door closing behind me like the punctuation to a sentence I wasn't ready to finish. I knew then that the truth was within reach, but I also knew it would shatter me. And yet I couldn't stop, couldn't let it rest. The loose threads of suspicion were beginning to weave themselves into a tapestry of certainty, one I desperately wanted to unravel even as I feared what lay beneath. That night, after the kids were in bed and the house had settled into its usual rhythm of silence, I confronted Sarah. I didn't plan to. It wasn't a calculated moment, but rather a collision of frustration and exhaustion. She was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing a wine glass, and I stood in the doorway, watching her as if seeing her for the first time. My wife, the woman I had built my life with, now seemed like a stranger to me. "Sarah," I said, my voice heavier than I intended, "I need to know the truth." She turned, drying her hands on a dish towel, her expression shifting from curiosity to wariness. "The truth about what?" I pulled the photo from my pocket and placed it on the counter between us. "About Mark. About this." Her eyes flicked to the photo, and in that instant, I saw it. A flicker of something that was neither surprise nor confusion but recognition. She quickly masked it, but it was too late. I had already seen the crack in her composure. "Why are you so hung up on this?" she asked, her tone defensive. "It's just a picture, John. You're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" I countered, my voice rising. "Because I've talked to Mark. I found the letters, Sarah. Don't insult me by pretending this is nothing." She opened her mouth as if to respond but then closed it again, her gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched between us, a chasm filled with all the things she wasn't saying. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh and leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secret was finally too much to bear. "It was 5 years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I went to visit my parents. Mark was there, visiting his own family. We ran into each other, and it just happened." The room seemed to tilt as her words sank in. It just happened. As if infidelity was a random act of nature, an accident she had stumbled into rather than a choice she had made. My fists clenched at my sides, and I fought the urge to shout, to break something, to let the rage that was boiling inside me spill out. "How long?" I asked through gritted teeth. "How long were you with him?" She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was just that one weekend. A mistake, John. A horrible, stupid mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "Mistakes are forgetting your keys or burning dinner. This was a betrayal, Sarah. Of me, of our family." Her tears began to fall then, streaming down her face, as she struggled to find the words to defend herself. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't think you'd ever find out." That last admission was like a slap in the face. She hadn't even considered the possibility of my knowing. She had planned to carry this secret to her grave, leaving me to live in ignorance while she bore the weight of her guilt. "How could you do this?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "How could you throw away everything we've built for him?" She didn't answer, and in her silence, I found my answer. Mark had been a temptation she couldn't resist, a connection from her past that had lured her away from the life we had built together. And now, 5 years later, the consequences of her actions were unraveling our marriage. I left the room without another word, retreating to the sanctuary of our bedroom. I needed space to think, to process what I had just learned. The woman I had loved and trusted for 2 decades had betrayed me, and though she called it a mistake, it felt deliberate, calculated even. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the pain of her betrayal gave way to something darker. Resolve. She thought she could confess, cry, and move on, but I wouldn't let it be that easy. I wouldn't let her escape the consequences of what she had done. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, then I would ensure she felt the full weight of her decision. The days that followed Sarah's confession were a blur of anger, planning, and quiet devastation. I barely spoke to her, and when I did, it was through clenched teeth. She hovered around the house, her remorse hanging heavy in the air, but it did little to soften my resolve. She had shattered the foundation of our marriage, and now I was determined to make her feel the aftershocks. I started with the kids. It wasn't easy. They adored their mother, and I wrestled with the morality of involving them. But my anger demanded an outlet, and I needed them to know the truth, or at least my version of it. I sat them down one evening, my voice measured but firm, and explained that their mother had done something that hurt our family deeply. I avoided the sordid details but made it clear she was the cause of the tension in the house. The betrayal in their eyes mirrored my own, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. Sarah had made her choices, and now she would reap the consequences. Next came the practicalities. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who came highly recommended by a colleague. I laid everything out for her. The affair, the timeline, the years of deceit. She listened without judgment, her pen scratching furiously across a notepad. "You have a strong case," she said finally, looking up at me, "especially if you can prove she was unfaithful. Judges don't look kindly on that in this state." I handed her the photo, my proof, and watched as she nodded approvingly. "We'll make sure you come out of this on top," she assured me. "Your wife won't know what hit her." The weeks that followed were a flurry of paperwork, strategy sessions, and quiet whispers with my lawyer. Sarah knew something was coming, but I kept my plans close to my chest. She had underestimated me for years, assuming my kindness was weakness, but now she was about to see just how wrong she had been. When the papers were finally served, her reaction was exactly what I had expected. She was blindsided, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to reconsider. "We can work through this," she pleaded. "For the kids. For us." But her words fell on deaf ears. "You already made your choice, Sarah," I said coldly. "This is just the consequence." The divorce proceedings were brutal. My lawyer was relentless, uncovering every financial misstep, every detail that could tilt the scales in my favor. By the time it was over, Sarah was left with almost nothing. The house was mine, as were the savings, investments, and custody of the children. She had visitation rights, of course, but the damage to her relationship with them was done. They barely spoke to her, their anger and confusion a barrier she couldn't cross. Sarah moved in with her parents, a shadow of the woman I once knew. The vibrant, confident partner I had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by someone worn down by guilt and loss. I should have felt victorious, but instead, I was left with a hollow sense of triumph. Revenge hadn't healed the wound she had inflicted. It had only deepened it. Months passed, and life settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. The kids adjusted to the changes, though their relationship with Sarah remained strained. I threw myself into work, into rebuilding a life that felt worth living. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, the anger would give way to sadness. Sarah's betrayal had destroyed more than just our marriage. It had taken a piece of me, too. I wondered if I would ever trust again, ever love again. But those were questions for another time. For now, I focused on moving forward, step by step, leaving the wreckage of our life together behind.